Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're going to be delving into one of history's most necessary and yet most reviled professions. It's a job that existed in that strange, murky space between law and taboo, a role absolutely essential for the functioning of medieval society, but one that would cost the person who held it almost everything. We're going to talk about the incredible grit and the profound loneliness of the medieval executioner. It's a story that's as much about the human need for order as it is about our desperate need to look away from the things that maintain it. As always, if you enjoy this kind of quiet exploration of the past, I'd be incredibly grateful if you'd consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It really does help this little corner of the internet grow, and I'm always so fascinated to see where everyone is tuning in from, this global community of quiet listeners. So if you feel up to it, let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. It's always a treat to see. Now though, it's time to get comfortable. Dim the lights, maybe adjust your pillows one last time, take a slow, deep breath. Let the noise of the day begin to fade into a soft, distant hum. There's nothing else you need to do right now, except relax and let your mind drift back with me as we explore the life of the man nobody wanted to know. Chapter 1. The Pariah's Paradox. Recruitment and Social Ostracism. So, you want to be a medieval executioner? Let's just pause on that for a moment. In a world of farmers, blacksmiths, merchants and priests, what series of unfortunate events, what cosmic roll of the dice leads a person to the gallows, not as a customer, but as the staff? It wasn't exactly a career path that guidance counsellors, had they existed, would be recommending. There were no job fairs, no apprenticeships advertised in the town square. This was a profession one fell into, was born into, or was forced into. It was, in almost every case, a life sentence of its own. The first and perhaps most common path was simply a matter of bad luck in the birth lottery. It was a family business. If your father was the executioner, there was a very, very good chance that you would be the next one. This wasn't the cosy, respectable inheritance of a bakery or a cooperage, where a son would proudly learn the trade at his father's knee. This was an inheritance of shame, a legacy of blood and social exclusion, passed down like a genetic curse. From a young age, a son would learn the family trade, not through proud instruction, but through quiet observation and grim necessity. He would learn the anatomy of the human body, not for healing, but for breaking. He would learn the heft of an axe, the pull of a rope, the specific brutal physics of a professionally administered death. Imagine being that child. While other children were learning to churn butter or shoe a horse, you were learning how to tie a noose that wouldn't slip. While they played games in the village green, you were likely confined to the strange, isolated patch of land your family was forced to live on. Your own name was already tainted by your father's. You were the executioner's son, a title whispered with a mixture of fear and disgust. There was no escaping it. The die was cast the moment you were born. For these individuals, there was no choice. The path was laid out, a grim, lonely road stretching from their father's scaffold to their own. But what if you weren't born into it? What if you came from a normal family? How, then, does one end up in this line of work? Well, another common recruitment method was what we might call the ultimate plea bargain. Picture this. You're a criminal. You've been tried. You've been found guilty of a capital offence. You're standing in a cold, damp cell, contemplating the very short remainder of your life. The door creaks open. A magistrate, or perhaps a city official, enters. He looks at you, not with pity, but with a kind of grim practicality. He explains your situation, which you are already painfully aware of. You are to be executed. However, there is a small wrinkle. The town's executioner has recently died, or perhaps fled, or simply become too old and shaky for the work. The town needs a replacement, and they are prepared to make you an offer. Your life, in exchange for a lifetime of taking the lives of others. It's a truly diabolical choice. A Hobson's choice, really. On one hand, certain immediate death. On the other, a life of sorts. A life where you would be fed, housed, and even paid. But it would be a life lived in the shadows. A life where you would become the very thing you currently fear. You would have to perform the same act on others that was meant for you. You would trade your own death for the duty of delivering it to countless men and women in the future. Many, faced with the stark reality of the noose or the axe, took the deal. They chose life. But it was a life irrevocably stained. A life as a pariah. They would walk out of that prison cell, not as a free man, but as a different kind of prisoner, shackled for the rest of their days to the post of the executioner. And then there was the third door, Perhaps the most tragic of all, desperation, for the truly destitute, for the man with a starving family and no prospects. The role of executioner, for all its horror, offered something almost irresistible: stability. Executioners were technically civil servants. They often received a salary from the city or the local lord. They might be given a house, albeit a house nobody else wanted, and sometimes even a strange set of perks. They were often allowed to claim the clothes of the condemned, or a certain portion of goods from the market. In a world teetering on the edge of famine, where one bad harvest could mean starvation for an entire village, a steady, guaranteed wage was a powerful lure. So a man pushed to the absolute brink might volunteer. He would make a conscious choice to step out of society in order to provide for his family. He would trade his good name, his friends, his place in the community, for a loaf of bread. It was a deal with the devil born of utter necessity. He would become the monster in the town's nightmares, so that his own children wouldn't starve. So you've taken the job. Whether by birth, by bargain, or by desperation, you are now the town executioner. Congratulations, you have a steady income and a roof over your head. You are also now fundamentally and permanently unclean. This is where we encounter the Pariah's paradox. You are an agent of justice, the very hand of the law, yet you are now considered dishonorable, untouchable, and infamous. In the Germanic-speaking lands of the Holy Roman Empire, there was a specific legal and social concept for this: Unehrlichkeit, or dishonorability. It wasn't just a vague social stigma, it was a formal status. To be dishonorable meant you were stripped of certain rights and privileges that ordinary people took for granted. And the executioner was the poster child for Unehrlichkeit. His trade was considered unclean or infamous. This wasn't because he was necessarily a bad person, but because his work involved the shedding of blood and the touching of the dead. It contaminated him. This concept of contamination was deeply literal to the medieval mind. The dishonor was a stain that could not be washed off. It was believed to be physically present on him, a kind of permanent, invisible filth. This is why the social ostracism was so absolute and so bizarrely specific. An executioner walking into a market might find people literally pulling their goods away from his reach. He wasn't allowed to touch the fruit and vegetables himself, lest his infamous hands taint the produce for everyone else. He would have to point at what he wanted, and the merchant, often grimacing, would handle the transaction, perhaps dropping the coins into a separate bowl, so as not to touch the executioner's money directly. Think about that for a second. The simple human act of choosing your own bread or apples, denied to you. Every public interaction was a minefield of small humiliations, a constant reminder of your lowly status. This enforced separation extended to every facet of life. At the local tavern, he couldn't drink from the common tankard. A separate cup or mug, the executioner's cup, would be kept for him, and no one else would ever dare to use it. When he paid, he might have to place his coins on the bar and have the innkeeper sweep them into his hand, again to avoid direct contact. In church, which he was often obligated to attend to show he was still a Christian, he would not be allowed to enter through the main door with the rest of the congregation. He would have to use a separate, smaller entrance and sit in a designated sinner's bench at the very back, far away from the respectable townsfolk. He was present, but not a part of the community he served. He was a ghost in his own town. And where did this ghost live? Almost universally, the executioner's residence was a physical manifestation of his social isolation. He was often required to live outside the city walls, a literal outcast. If he did live within the city, it was in the most undesirable quarter imaginable. His neighbours weren't the baker or the candlestick maker. His neighbours were the other dishonourable trades, the tanners, whose work involved animal hides and caustic, foul-smelling chemicals, the gravediggers, the latrine cleaners, the knackers, who disposed of dead animal carcasses. It was the part of town you held your nose to walk through, a ghetto of the unclean. Often his home was strategically placed. It might be right next to the gallows itself, or the pillory, or the breaking wheel, a constant grim reminder of his profession, ensuring that even in his own home he could never escape the tools of his trade. The view from his window wasn't a pleasant market square, it was the apparatus of death he was required to operate. This wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. It sent a clear message to everyone. This is the man who deals with death, and so he shall live among the dead. This social taint was tragically contagious. It wasn't just the executioner who was infamous. His entire family was enveloped by it. His wife became the executioner's wife, shunned by the other women in town. His children were the executioner's children, taunted, bullied, and isolated from their peers. This is what made the hereditary nature of the job so inescapable. Who else would the executioner's son marry but the daughter of another executioner from a neighbouring town? Who else would accept him? An entire insular subculture developed out of sheer necessity. They were a caste apart, forced to socialise, marry, and live within their own small, despised community. The paradox was woven into the very fabric of his duties. On the day of an execution, the executioner was the centre of a huge public spectacle. He would lead the condemned through the streets, the whole town watching. He was, in that moment, the most important man there, the fulcrum of justice. He was the one who upheld the law, who carried out the will of the court, who purged the community of a perceived evil. He was doing God's work, in a way, or at least the king's. But the moment the deed was done, the moment the trapdoor fell, or the axe swung, that temporary fearsome importance vanished. The crowd that had just been watching him with rapt, terrified attention would now recoil from him. He would clean his tools, collect his fee, and walk home. And on that walk, people would cross the street to avoid him. They would avert their eyes. They would make signs against evil as he passed. He had performed his essential function, and for doing so, he was once again polluted, pushed back to the very margins of the society he had just protected. He was the necessary evil, the sin-eater for the entire community. They needed his hands to be dirty so theirs could remain clean, and for that service they despised him. This created a strange and powerful psychological burden. The executioner was often feared, of course. People believed he had secret knowledge, perhaps even dabbled in dark magic. The tools of his trade, the rope from a hanging, a severed hand, were considered powerful magical artifacts. People might secretly approach him to buy such things, or to ask for folk remedies, as his anatomical knowledge was often greater than the local barber surgeons, so he was at once an outcast and a source of dark power. He was both reviled and, in a strange way, respected for his terrifying craft. He lived his life walking a tightrope. He had to be strong enough to perform his brutal duties, but passive enough to accept the daily humiliation. He had to be a model of grim sobriety, as a drunk or incompetent executioner could botch a job, turning a swift execution into a horrific spectacle of suffering, which could incite a riot against him. He was held to an incredibly high standard in a job no one wanted, and his reward for perfect performance was to be utterly alone. He was a pillar of the justice system, who was himself denied the simple justice of being treated like a human being. This was the foundational reality for anyone who took up the mask and the axe. Before we even get to the grim mechanics of the job itself, the psychology of taking a life, the physical toll, the ever-present danger, we have to understand this basic crushing truth. To become an executioner was to undergo a kind of social death. It was to willingly step into a role that placed you in a box, sealed it shut, and wrote unclean on the lid. Your world shrank to the size of your isolated home, the path to the scaffold, and the averted gazes of every single person you passed along the way. It was a life of profound and inescapable loneliness, the price of performing society's most terrible and most necessary work. Chapter 2. Instruments of Justice, the burden of a terrible skill. And that loneliness, that social death, had a physical form. It had weight and a cutting edge. It lived in a leather sheath or coiled in a dark corner of his home. It wasn't an abstract concept. You could touch it, feel its cold, unforgiving reality against your palm. We're talking, of course, about the tools of the trade, the instruments of so-called justice. To us, they are museum pieces, grim artifacts behind glass. But to the executioner, they were his constant companions, the very source of his pariah status, and, paradoxically, his professional pride. To understand the executioner, we have to understand his relationship with these objects. It wasn't the casual relationship a carpenter has with his hammer. It was something far more intimate, more complex, and infinitely more burdensome. These weren't just tools, they were extensions of the state's will, imbued with all the terror and authority of the law, and they demanded a terrible, terrible skill to wield. This wasn't a job for a clumsy brute. The public, for all its bloodlust, demanded a performance. They demanded efficiency. They demanded a good death. A botched job wasn't just a professional failure. It was an insult to the condemned, an offence to God, and a direct invitation for a crowd of thousands to turn their fury from the person on the scaffold to the person standing beside it. Let's begin with what many considered the most noble of these instruments, the executioner's sword. The very idea is a strange contradiction. We associate the sword with chivalry, with knights and duels of honor, but this was a different beast entirely. An executioner's sword was a highly specialized piece of equipment, a grim marvel of engineering designed for one singular, horrifying purpose. If you were to see one, you'd notice a few things immediately. It was long, often a two-handed affair, requiring significant strength to wield, but more tellingly, it had no point. The tip was squared off, or sometimes rounded. This was not a weapon for stabbing or fencing. It was, in the most literal sense, a massive, sharpened, perfectly balanced cleaver in the shape of a sword. Its purpose was not to fight, but to end. The balance was everything. A swordsmith would labor to create a blade that felt almost alive in the hands, with a center of gravity calculated to allow for a swift, unstoppable arc. The steel had to be of the highest quality, capable of holding a razor's edge, because the target was deceptively difficult. The human neck is a complex column of muscle, sinew and bone. To sever it in a single, clean stroke was not a matter of simple force. It was an act of brutal, anatomical precision. You had to know exactly where to strike, the precise point between vertebrae where the blade had the best chance of passing through without being deflected, or, horrifyingly, stuck. And so the executioner had to be a student of the human body. He wouldn't have used Latin terms or hung anatomical charts on his wall, but through grim experience he knew the landscape of the neck better than any physician. He would often have the condemned kneel, sometimes blindfolded, sometimes not. The position was crucial. The head had to be tilted forward, stretching the skin and muscles taut over the vertebrae, presenting the ideal target. The executioner would take his stance, feet planted wide, measuring the distance with his eyes. The weight of the sword, often weighing over 4 or 5 pounds, would feel immense. The crowd would fall into a deep, expectant hush. The only sound would be the wind, a distant cough, the soft prayer of the priest, and the frantic beating of 2 hearts on the scaffold. This was not a job for someone prone to performance anxiety. If you get nervous giving a presentation to your colleagues, imagine that same feeling, but your job is to perfectly cleave a human head from its shoulders while several thousand people watch. And if your hand trembles, they might just decide to tear you apart with their bare hands. The pressure is almost impossible for us to comprehend. He would lift the sword high, the polished steel catching the light. It was a moment of pure theatre, the culmination of the entire judicial process. And in that moment, as the sword reached the apex of its arc, the executioner was no longer an outcast. He was a terrifying priest, performing a dark sacrament. The swing itself had to be a masterpiece of controlled power, not a wild hack, but a fluid, drawing slice. The blade had to move through the air with a quiet swoosh, entering the neck at the perfect angle and exiting without a hitch. A clean cut meant the head would fall instantly, the body slumping forward. It was as close to a merciful death as one could get in such circumstances. The crowd would murmur its approval. The executioner had done his job well. He could wipe his blade, his face an impassive mask, and collect his fee. But if he failed, the consequences were unthinkable. A misplaced blow could strike the shoulder, inflicting a ghastly but non-fatal wound. A blow that was too high might slice through the jaw and skull. Worst of all was the blow that struck the spine but failed to sever it, leaving the condemned writhing in unimaginable agony. This was the ultimate professional nightmare. The crowd's approval would curdle into a roar of rage. They saw it as an act of gratuitous cruelty, a torment inflicted upon a soul that was supposed to be sent to its maker. Stones, rotten vegetables, and anything else at hand would begin to fly. The guards would have to protect the executioner, as he, trembling and horrified, would be forced to take a second, or even a third, hack to finish the gruesome task. His reputation would be shattered. He might be run out of town, or in some cases the mob would seize him right then and there. His life was balanced on the edge of his own sword. The sword itself was often an object of grim ceremony. Many were engraved with symbols of justice or solemn mottos. A famous German executioner's sword bore the inscription, "When I raise this sword, I wish the sinner eternal life." It's a chilling sentiment, a way of psychologically distancing the wielder from the act. He is not the killer, he is merely the instrument, the final, regretful step in a long process. These swords were passed down from father to son, a dark and heavy inheritance. They had to be meticulously cared for. After each use, the blade had to be cleaned of blood and tissue immediately to prevent rust. The edge had to be constantly honed, checked for nicks or imperfections that could cause the blade to catch. It was a craftsman's devotion applied to an instrument of death. In the quiet of his isolated home, you can imagine the executioner sitting by the fire, a whetstone in his hand, slowly, methodically drawing it along the massive blade, the rhythmic scrape the only sound in the room, a lonely man tending to the tool that defined and destroyed his life. Of course, the sword was generally reserved for the nobility. The idea was that a death by the sword was more honourable, a nod to the beheaded person's social standing. It was a class-based system even in death. For the common criminal, a more rustic tool was often employed, the axe. If the sword was a finely tuned instrument of brutal precision, the axe was a tool of brute force. Its use is most famously associated with England, and it projects a far grimmer, more visceral image. An axe requires less finesse than a sword, but it is in no way easier to use effectively. The physics are entirely different. A sword cuts with a long, slicing edge. An axe smashes and cleaves with focused weight. The executioner's axe was not the same as a wood-chopping axe. It would have a long handle for leverage and a heavy, broad, crescent-shaped head to provide a wide cutting surface. And with the axe came its grim partner, the chopping block. This simple piece of wood is seared into our collective consciousness. It solved one of the key problems of a beheading. It forced the condemned into a static, stable position. The prisoner would be made to lay their head down on the block, their neck exposed. This removed some of the guesswork for the executioner, but it introduced new horrors. The condemned was face down, often in straw or sawdust meant to soak up the blood, their last sight the rough-hewn wood of the block. The executioner's task was still immensely difficult. He had to bring the axe down with tremendous force in exactly the right place. The broad head of the axe was more forgiving than a sword's narrow edge, but a miss could be just as catastrophic. A blow too far up could strike the back of the skull. A blow too low could hit the shoulders. The sheer percussive force of an axe blow was devastating. Unlike the clean slice of the sword, an axe blow was a shattering event. We have accounts of executions by axe that went horribly wrong. Sir Walter Raleigh's execution is one. He famously had to encourage the hesitant executioner, saying, "Strike, man, strike." Even Anne Boleyn, who was afforded the mercy of a skilled swordsman brought over from France, was terrified of the axeman of the Tower of London, who was notoriously clumsy. Her choice of a swordsman was a calculated decision to ensure a swift end. The axeman had to contend with the same public pressure, the same need for a clean one-strike kill, but the aesthetics were different. The axe felt more agricultural, more common, a tool of the abattoir brought to the scaffold. It was a messy, bloody, shattering business, and it reinforced the social divide. The noble gets the clean, swift swoosh of the sword. The peasant gets the crude, visceral thump of the axe. The tool not only performed the execution, it broadcast a message about the worth of the person being killed. And just like the sword, the axe had to be maintained. Its edge needed to be kept brutally sharp. A dull axe was a recipe for disaster. It would tear and crush rather than cut. The executioner would spend his hours with a file and stone, ensuring the instrument of his livelihood was in perfect condition. It's a strange image, a man ostracized by society for his work, taking a craftsman's pride in the tool that makes him a monster in their eyes. But what choice did he have? His survival, both professionally and literally, depended on it. Now, let's move away from the blade and turn our attention to something that seems, on the surface, far simpler: the rope. Hanging was one of the most common forms of execution across Europe for centuries. It was cheap, it was effective, and it provided a lasting, visible deterrent. A body left swinging from the gallows at a crossroads was a powerful message from the authorities. But the apparent simplicity of hanging masks a grim and complex science. Getting it right was just as difficult as a beheading, and the definition of right changed over time. For much of the medieval period, hanging wasn't about a quick, humane death. The goal was death by strangulation. The condemned would be placed on a ladder or in a cart with a noose around their neck. The ladder would be turned over or the cart would be pulled away, leaving them to dangle. This was known as the short drop. It was an agonizingly slow way to die. The pressure of the noose would cut off the carotid arteries, leading to unconsciousness, but it would also slowly constrict the airway. The person would thrash and struggle for several minutes, a horrifying spectacle that was grimly nicknamed the hangman's jig. Their face would congest with blood, turning purple and blue. It was a brutal, terrifying, and very public suffocation. The executioner's skill here was not in ensuring a quick death, but in ensuring death itself. The knot was paramount. It had to be a slip knot that would tighten under the person's weight. but it couldn't be so complex that it failed to close properly. The famous hangman's knot, with its distinctive 13 coils, was designed to be both intimidating and brutally effective. The coils added weight and friction, ensuring the loop snapped tight and stayed that way. The placement of the knot was also important. Placing it under the chin would jerk the head back, while placing it under the ear would twist the neck, both of which helped to hasten the process of strangulation. The executioner was a master of rope. He knew how different types of rope hemp was common, behaved under strain in wet weather or dry. He had to calculate the length needed, ensure it was free of frays or weak spots. A rope that snapped was the ultimate embarrassment. It was seen by the superstitious crowd as a sign of divine intervention, that the condemned was innocent in the eyes of God. A riot was almost guaranteed in such a situation. The prisoner would often be freed by the mob, and the executioner would be lucky to escape with his life. In some cases, the executioner or his assistants would actively hasten the death. They might pull on the condemned person's legs to tighten the noose, a grim act of mercy to shorten the suffering. The family of the condemned might even bribe the hangman to do this, to ensure their loved one's final moments were not a prolonged public agony. This adds another layer to the executioner's strange role. He was both the agent of death and, for a price, an agent of mercy. As we move into the later periods, a more scientific approach to hanging developed, leading to the long drop. This is where the physics become truly crucial. The idea was to use the force of a longer fall to break the person's neck, causing instantaneous death, or at least immediate unconsciousness. This required the executioner to be a grim mathematician. He needed to calculate the length of the drop, based on the condemned person's weight and height. Too short a drop, and you're back to slow, agonizing strangulation. Too long a drop, and the force would be so great that it could, and sometimes did, rip the head clean off the body. This was considered the most ghastly of all botched executions. It was an appalling spectacle that horrified the crowd, and utterly disgraced the hangman. So he had his tables, his calculations, a morbid form of engineering where the tolerances were incredibly fine. He had to be precise. The ideal outcome was a fracture of the second or third cervical vertebrae, severing the spinal cord. It was a clinical, cold and calculated application of force to the human body. The rope, then, was not just a piece of cord. It was a carefully chosen and prepared instrument. It was often kept coiled in a bag, sometimes treated with tallow or soap to help the knot slide smoothly. After an execution, pieces of the hangman's rope were sometimes sought after as good luck charms or cures for ailments. The executioner could supplement his income by selling these morbid relics. It's a bizarre transaction. A piece of the tool that made him an outcast becomes a coveted object for the very people who shun him. It highlights the strange, contradictory relationship society had with this man and his work. He was both reviled and, in a dark way, magical. But not all executions were meant to be swift. Some were designed as the ultimate expression of state-sponsored terror, a prolonged and agonizing spectacle meant to be etched into the memory of all who witnessed it. And for that, there was perhaps no instrument more dreadful than the breaking wheel. The breaking wheel, or the Catherine wheel, was a masterpiece of cruelty. It was a form of execution that didn't just kill, it systematically destroyed the human body while keeping the victim alive for as long as possible. The skill of the executioner here was not in mercy or speed, but in control. He had to be a conductor of an orchestra of pain. The process was brutally simple in its concept. The condemned, usually stripped bare, would be tied to a large wooden wagon wheel, their limbs stretched out along the spokes, or sometimes they would be staked to the ground. The executioner would then use a heavy iron bar, or even the wheel itself as a bludgeon. The goal was to shatter the bones of the limbs, but there was a precise order to it. It was what was politely called breaking from the bottom up. The executioner would start with the shins, then the thighs, then the forearms, then the upper arms. With each blow, he had to apply just enough force to shatter the bone without rupturing the skin too much, which would cause the victim to bleed out too quickly. The sound of the iron bar hitting bone, the sickening crunch, would echo across the silent square. The screams of the condemned would be unimaginable. This required a ghastly expertise. The executioner had to know just where to strike to break the bone cleanly. He was, in a sense, performing a reverse surgery, deconstructing the human skeleton piece by piece. Between each series of blows he might pause, allowing the victim to feel the full, radiating agony of their shattered limbs. The crowd would watch, mesmerized and terrified. This was not about justice for a past crime. This was about demonstrating the absolute and terrifying power of the ruler. It was a warning, written in the medium of a broken human body. After the limbs were broken, the victim, now a broken, moaning wreck but still conscious, would be woven into the spokes of the wheel. Their shattered, pliable limbs would be threaded through the gaps, creating a grotesque parody of the human form. The wheel would then be hoisted onto a tall pole, and the victim would be left there, exposed to the elements, to be picked at by crows, and to slowly die of shock, dehydration and exposure. Death could take hours, sometimes even days. There was, however, a merciful version of this execution. It was called the coup de grâce, the blow of grace. After breaking the limbs, the executioner would be instructed to deliver 2 or 3 final, powerful blows to the chest and neck, killing the victim instantly. Whether this final act of mercy was granted depended on the nature of the crime and the decree of the judge. An executioner who delivered the coup de grâce without being ordered to could be severely punished. His job was to follow the sentence to the letter, no matter how cruel. Wielding that iron bar required a particular kind of mental fortitude. It was one thing to end a life with a single, swift sword stroke. It was another thing entirely to stand before a conscious, screaming human being and systematically break their body apart over the course of an hour, all while a massive crowd watched your every move. The psychological toll must have been immense. The executioner had to wall off his empathy, to see the person before him not as a fellow human, but as an object upon which a sentence must be carried out. He had to become as cold and hard as the iron bar in his hands. And of course, there were other tools in his gruesome kit. Branding irons, for marking criminals for life. The designs were often specific to the town or the crime. A fleur-de-lis in France, for example. The executioner had to know how to heat the iron to the correct temperature. Too cool, and it wouldn't leave a permanent mark. Too hot, and it could cause a life-threatening burn. It was another grim area of expertise. There were tongs for tearing flesh, knives for mutilation, saws for quartering the bodies of traitors after they had been hanged. His workshop was a place of nightmares. Each of these tools, from the grand executioner's sword to the simple branding iron, represented a burden. The physical burden of their weight and maintenance was nothing compared to the psychological weight they carried. When the executioner walked through town, people didn't just see him, they saw the sword, the noose, the wheel. He was inseparable from his instruments. They were the symbols of his pollution, the reason children were hurried away from his path, and his touch was thought to bring bad luck. Yet, within the perverse logic of his profession, they were also the source of his standing. A master executioner, one who could guarantee a clean beheading every time, who could calculate the long drop to the inch, was a valuable commodity. Towns would bid for his services. He could command high fees. His skill, his terrible intimate knowledge of death, and the tools used to inflict it, was his only asset in a world that despised him. It was the ultimate paradox. The very thing that made him an outcast was the only thing that allowed him to survive. He was trapped, defined not by who he was, but by the cold, unforgiving steel, wood and hemp that he kept in his lonely home, waiting for the next time society would call upon him to do its most terrible work. Chapter 3. The Price of Blood. The Grim Economics of a Despised Profession. But that cold, unforgiving steel and wood, that length of hemp rope, it wasn't just a set of tools, it was a business. A very strange, very grim, and surprisingly complex business. To think of the medieval executioner as a salaried state employee, like a clerk or a bailiff, is to fundamentally misunderstand his place in the world. He was less a public servant and more a freelancer, an independent contractor specializing in the terminal and the taboo. His life was governed not by a steady wage, but by the grim economics of supply and demand. And in his world, the demand was for suffering, and the supply was whatever the local magistrate sent his way. So let's talk about money. Let's peel back the leather hood and look at the ledger book, because this is where the executioner's story gets truly fascinating. It moves beyond the simple act of ending a life, and into a complex web of side hustles, black markets, and what we might today call a highly diversified revenue stream. First, there was the basic fee schedule. This wasn't a handshake deal. Towns and cities had official, itemized lists of payments for services rendered. It was a macabre menu of horrors, priced out with the chilling banality of a grocery list. A simple hanging might be worth a certain amount, but a beheading, which required significantly more skill and a much more expensive tool in the form of a good steel sword, would command a higher price. Beheading with an axe was cheaper, a bit messier, but it got the job done. Then you had the premium services, burning at the stake. That was complicated. It involved sourcing wood, building the pyre, managing the crowd, and ensuring the whole affair went according to plan. That cost a pretty penny. And then there was the truly artisanal work. Breaking on the wheel was a multi-stage process, a gruesome piece of theatre that required precision and a strong stomach. Each blow had to be calculated, not too hard, not too soft, to shatter the limbs without killing the condemned outright. This was the top-shelf, connoisseur level of public punishment, and it was priced accordingly. Torture, too, was itemized. A certain fee for the application of thumbscrews, another for the rack, perhaps with a surcharge for each turn of the wheel. Putting someone to the question, as they so politely called it, was a service with a clear price tag. The executioner would present his invoice to the town council, and after some grumbling, he would be paid from the public coffers. But here's the problem with that business model. It's entirely dependent on a steady stream of crime. What happens during a period of relative peace and quiet? What if the local lord is feeling merciful, or the harvest is good and people are too busy and well-fed to cause the kind of trouble that ends on a scaffold? Well, for the executioner, a peaceful month was a financially devastating month. No criminals meant no income. He couldn't exactly drum up business, walking through the town square shouting about a 2-for-1 special on hangings. His primary source of revenue was terrifyingly unreliable. It's a bit like being a wedding photographer who only gets paid if there's a divorce. The very thing he profits from is a social ill. This inherent instability forced the executioner to become an entrepreneur of the unsavory. He had to find other ways to make ends meet, and society, in its own strange and compartmentalizing way, had already decided what kind of work he was suited for. You see, the executioner belonged to a group of professions known in the German-speaking lands as the dishonorable trades. These were jobs that, for one reason or another, were considered tainted. They dealt with death, with filth, with the unclean aspects of life that good, God-fearing people wanted nothing to do with. And since the executioner was already the most dishonorable man in town, it only made sense to lump all the other dirty jobs onto his plate. It was a package deal of social ostracism. If you were going to be an outcast, you might as well be a busy one. So what were these side hustles? Well, let's start with what was politely called knackering. The knacker, or flayer, was responsible for the disposal of animal carcasses. When a horse grew too old to pull a cart, when a cow succumbed to disease, when a plague swept through the town's pig population, you didn't call a sanitation department. You called the executioner. It was his job to haul the dead animal out of town to a designated spot, the flayer's yard, a piece of land that you could smell long before you could see it. Imagine that place for a moment. A field littered with the bones and offal of countless animals, buzzing with flies, stalked by stray dogs, the air thick with the sweet, heavy stench of decay. Here the executioner would put his anatomical knowledge to a different use. He'd skin the animal. Because the hide was valuable, he'd butcher the carcass, boiling the bones and fat down into tallow for candles and soap. Nothing was wasted. It was a filthy, stomach-turning job, but it was a steady source of income. Animals, unlike condemned criminals, died with reliable frequency. And if you think about it, the logic is sound, in a grim sort of way. Who else in town had a strong stomach, a proficiency with sharp blades, and a complete indifference to the gore and viscera of a dismembered body? The skill set was perfectly transferable. The same hands that could expertly sever a human spine could also efficiently strip the hide from a dead horse. To the townspeople, it was all of a piece. The man who handled the dead was the man who handled the dead, whether they had 2 legs or 4, but his portfolio of the disgusting didn't end there. Another of his common duties was that of cesspool and latrine cleaner. Before the invention of modern sewage systems, waste management was a much more direct affair. Every home had a privy or a latrine that emptied into a pit in the backyard or the cellar. When that pit was full, someone had to empty it, and you can guess who drew the short straw. It was often the executioner or his assistants working in the dead of night, who would climb down into that stinking darkness, shovel the accumulated filth into barrels, and cart it away to be used as fertilizer in the fields outside the city walls. It's almost comically awful, isn't it? One day, you are the terrifying instrument of state power, standing on a scaffold in a black hood, the silent center of a morbid spectacle. The next, you're up to your waist in the collective waste of the very people who fear you, working by moonlight so they don't have to see or smell the reality of their own existence. Forget the psychological toll of taking human life. Imagine the sheer indignity of it. And yet it was work. It was money. It kept food on his table when the gallows stood empty. It was the great equalizer. No matter how powerful or pious the citizens of the town were, their waste stank just like everyone else's, and someone had to be paid to haul it away. His association with the unclean also extended to the moral sphere. In many towns, the executioner was also given the responsibility of overseeing the local brothel. This seems bizarre at first, until you apply the same medieval logic. Prostitution was seen as a necessary evil, a morally unclean but unavoidable part of city life. The women who worked in these establishments were themselves outcasts, living on the fringes of respectable society. So who better to manage this sordid little world than the man who was already the king of the outcasts? He was the town's vice squad and its sin manager, all rolled into one. He would ensure the brothel operated within certain rules, collect fees or taxes from the women, and mete out punishments to those who stepped out of line. It was just one more layer of his existence in the moral grey zone, profiting from the very things that society publicly condemned but privately tolerated. He might also be tasked with catching stray dogs, acting as a night watchman, or even performing rudimentary veterinary services. He was the town's Swiss Army knife for anything unpleasant. Each of these jobs reinforced his isolation. His hands were stained not just with blood, but with the literal and figurative filth of the entire community. He was a walking, breathing repository for all the things society wanted to forget. But we have not yet arrived at the most peculiar, and perhaps the most lucrative part of the executioner's economic life. All of these side hustles were born of necessity, of filling the gaps left by a fluctuating income. His real genius, however, lay in monetizing the direct byproducts of his primary profession. The executioner, you see, had a monopoly on a very particular, very valuable commodity, the human body. After the sentence was carried out, after the crowd dispersed and the final prayer had faded into the air, the question remained, what to do with the corpse? Often the families were forbidden from claiming the body, especially in cases of high treason. The corpse was legally the property of the state, and by extension its agent, the executioner. And a fresh human corpse, in the late Middle Ages and the early modern period, was an object of intense interest to two very different, but equally motivated groups of people, men of science and believers in folk magic. Let's start with the men of science. Across Europe, the study of anatomy was undergoing a revolution. Doctors and scholars were beginning to understand that to heal the human body, they first had to understand how it worked. And the only way to truly do that was through dissection. But there was a huge problem, a severe shortage of cadavers. The church took a very dim view of desecrating the bodies of the faithful. For centuries, dissection was a rare and highly restricted practice. The only bodies legally available for the anatomist's knife were, you guessed it, those of executed criminals. So you have this strange convergence. On one hand, a university professor, a man of letters and science, desperate for a specimen to teach his students the mysteries of the human form. On the other, the town executioner, a man who couldn't even enter a church, who happened to have exactly what the professor needed. This led to a clandestine, but well-established black market. After an execution, the executioner would discreetly arrange the sale of the body to the local medical school or a private physician. It was a transaction carried out in the shadows, a sack of coins exchanged for a sack containing a grim delivery. The executioner became the unwitting and indispensable supplier to the advancement of medicine. The very hands that ended a life would pass that life's vessel on to hands that hoped to save others. There's a profound irony in that. The detailed maps of human anatomy that would form the basis of modern surgery were often drawn from the bodies of thieves and murderers, supplied by a man no respectable doctor would ever invite to dinner. He was the grim gatekeeper of anatomical knowledge. But the demand from the surgeons, as strange as it was nothing compared to the demand from the general public for what we might call gallows remedies. This is where we delve deep into the world of folk medicine and magic, a world where the lines between the physical and the supernatural were beautifully, terrifyingly blurred. To the common person, the body of a condemned criminal, especially one who died in a state of high emotion and violence, was imbued with a powerful, almost magical energy, and the executioner was the sole purveyor of this dark medicine. The most sought-after product was human fat. In German, it had a specific name, Armesünderfett, which translates to poor sinner's fat. After an execution, particularly a gruesome one like breaking on the wheel, the executioner would collect the body, and in the privacy of his secluded home, render it down, much like he would an animal carcass. He would boil the body parts to separate the fat, which was then clarified and sold in small pots and vials as a miraculous cure-all. It was believed to be a potent remedy for all manner of ailments: rheumatism, arthritis, broken bones, gout. People would travel for miles to buy a small jar of this grim substance from the executioner's wife, who often acted as the storefront for this side of the family business. Imagine the scene: a farmer with an aching back, who has tried every herbal poultice and prayer, finally making his way to the executioner's door. He doesn't ask too many questions. He just hands over his coins and receives a small, greasy pot, hoping the lingering life force of a dead thief might somehow soothe his own pain. It was a very direct, if slightly ghoulish, approach to healthcare. Then there was the blood. There was a widespread belief, particularly in Germanic countries, that the warm blood of a freshly decapitated person could cure epilepsy, the so-called falling sickness. This led to truly macabre spectacles at the foot of the scaffold. As the executioner prepared his sword, epileptics or their family members would gather below, holding out cups and mugs. The moment the head was severed, they would rush forward, jostling to catch the gushing blood before it soaked into the wooden planks. The executioner often charged a fee for this privilege, for allowing people this close to the fountain of healing. He was, in essence, selling tickets to a bloodbath that was also a pharmacy. And the list goes on. The body was a treasure trove of magical ingredients. The finger bones of a thief could be used as an amulet. A piece of the hangman's rope was considered incredibly lucky, a charm to ward off evil or bring good fortune in gambling. The executioner would sell the rope by the inch, and it always sold out. Perhaps the most infamous of these byproducts was the hand of glory. This was the preserved and dried hand of a hanged man, preferably a murderer. According to folklore, if you placed a candle made from the fat of that same man into the hand of glory, it would have magical powers. It could render all who looked upon it motionless, making it the perfect tool for a burglar. It could unlock any door. The creation of such an object was, of course, the executioner's domain. He was the sole supplier for the magical underworld, crafting these gruesome artifacts for those who practice the darker arts. So let's step back and look at the man we have created. He is not just a state-sanctioned killer. He is a Nakaman, a waste remover, a brothel keeper, a dog catcher. He is a surgical supplier and a pharmacist of the forbidden. He runs a business where the raw materials are death and decay, and the products are tallow, leather, anatomical specimens, and magical cures. His home is a workshop, a laboratory, and a warehouse for the most taboo materials imaginable. This economic reality defined him as much as the axe on his shoulder. It meant he had to be more than just strong or fearsome. He had to be a shrewd businessman. He had to know the market price for a pound of sinner's fat, the going rate for a corpse delivered to the university, the right price for an inch of lucky rope. He had to negotiate with professors of medicine and practitioners of dark magic with equal pragmatism. He was deeply, inextricably enmeshed in the hidden machinery of his society, in its waste, its vices, its science, and its superstitions. His income, cobbled together from these disparate and desperate sources, allowed him to live, and sometimes to live quite well. A successful executioner in a large city could become a wealthy man, but it was a wealth that could never buy him entry into the world of the people he served. Every coin he earned was a reminder of his otherness. It was blood money, yes, but it was also filth money, and sin money, and bone money. Each transaction, whether for a hanging or for a pot of fat, pushed him further away, cementing his status as the necessary monster who profits from the darkness that respectable folk pretend does not exist. His lonely house, built on the foundations of this grim economy, was both his castle and his cage. Chapter 4. A Soul in Peril, Faith, Damnation, and the Executioner's Conscience. And so his house became his world, a fortress built not just of stone and timber, but of social necessity and profound echoing loneliness. Yet, for all its physical isolation, that house was nothing compared to the true cage he inhabited, the one built within his own soul. Because in the deeply, unshakably faithful world of medieval Europe, the money was only the beginning of his problems. The real question, the one that must have whispered to him in the dead of night, was not about his place in the town, but his place in eternity. In an age when heaven and hell were not abstract concepts but tangible destinations, as real as Paris or Jerusalem, what did it mean to be the man whose job description was a direct violation of one of God's most unambiguous commandments, "Thou shalt not kill"? It's not exactly a suggestion, and yet his entire career, his very existence, was predicated on doing just that. professionally, and on schedule. This is the great aching paradox of the medieval executioner. He was an instrument of what was called God's justice on earth. The king, the duke, the magistrate, they were all seen as ruling by divine right. Their laws were, by extension, God's laws. When they decreed a man must die, they were acting as God's deputies, and the executioner, he was simply the final tool in that holy process. He was the sword of the state, and the state was the arm of the Almighty. At least that was the official story. That was the neat, tidy theological paperwork that allowed the whole system to function without grinding to a halt in a crisis of conscience. Theologians, men like Augustine and Aquinas, had spent centuries crafting the arguments for this. They distinguished between murder, which was a sin born of private malice, and judicial killing, which was a public necessity, a regrettable but vital act to maintain a divinely ordained social order. The executioner, in this view, bore no personal guilt. He was merely a hand, guided by a righteous will. He was no more a murderer than a scalpel is a surgeon. It's a beautiful argument, clean, logical, and it likely provided a great deal of comfort to the judges and priests who had to condemn a man and then sleep soundly at night. But you have to wonder how convincing that argument felt to the man actually holding the sword, the man who had to look another human being in the eye, see the terror, hear the final desperate prayer, and then bring a sharpened piece of steel down on their neck. The paperwork might say you're just a tool, but your hands are the ones covered in blood. The common people certainly weren't debating the finer points of Augustinian theology down at the tavern. To them, the logic was far simpler. The executioner was a man who killed for money. He trafficked in death. His hands were permanently stained, not just with blood, but with sin. He was seen as ritually, spiritually, and permanently unclean. He was a necessary evil, emphasis on the evil, and nowhere was this spiritual quarantine more apparent than at the one place that was supposed to offer salvation to all, the church. Imagine it's Sunday morning. The bells are ringing across the city, a sound that promises community, grace, and a brief respite from the harshness of the world. Everyone is heading to Mass. The baker, the blacksmith, the weaver, the merchant, all putting on their best, if slightly worn clothes. They are a community, gathering to affirm their shared faith, to be cleansed, to be reminded that they are all children of God. And then there's the executioner. He might go to church. In fact, he was often expected to, but he did not go as one of the flock. He was the wolf, commanded to sit in the sheep pen. He would enter through a separate door if one was available, designated for those considered shameful or unclean, lepers, prostitutes, and him. If there was no separate door, he would have to wait until everyone else was inside before slipping in, a shadow in the house of light. He wouldn't be mingling, finding a seat with his family. His family, if they were brave enough to come with him, would share his stain. They would sit apart, in a designated section often called the sinner's corner, usually at the very back, near the door, sometimes on a simple wooden bench, while others had pews. It was the spiritual equivalent of the kids' table, but without any of the fun. From there he would watch the ceremony unfold at a distance. He could hear the priest's Latin, a mysterious and holy tongue. He could see the candles flickering on the altar, little stars of hope in the gloom. He could smell the incense, a scent meant to carry prayers up to heaven. But it was all happening over there. It was a world he could observe but not truly enter. The community would turn to share the kiss of peace, a ritual of connection and brotherhood. No one would turn to him. His neighbours would avert their eyes, perhaps making a subtle sign to ward off evil if he happened to catch their gaze. He was a ghost at the feast of God, a living reminder of the very violence and sin that everyone else had come to pray away. And then came the most crucial moment of the service, the central mystery of the faith, the Eucharist, the moment when the priest consecrates the bread and wine, transforming them, in the eyes of the faithful, into the literal body and blood of Jesus Christ. This was the ultimate act of communion, of being accepted into the body of the church and receiving God's grace. And for the executioner, this was the moment the invisible wall between him and salvation became solid as stone. In many places, he was explicitly forbidden from taking communion. How could a man whose hands had taken a life that very week dare to reach for the body of Christ? How could a mouth that had given the final grim command to a dying prisoner dare to receive the blood of the Saviour? His profession was a perpetual state of impurity, a mortal sin that was renewed with every swing of his axe, with every knot he tied in a noose. Think of confession. It was the safety valve of the medieval soul. You sin, you go to the priest, you confess in hushed tones, you receive your penance, a few prayers, maybe a small pilgrimage, and you are made clean again, your slate wiped, your soul back in a state of grace. But what could the executioner confess? Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. I did my job. The very act the state paid him for was the act that damned him in the eyes of the church. He couldn't repent for it, because he was going to have to do it again next Tuesday. His sin wasn't a moment of weakness, it was his 9 to 5. So he would sit in his corner, watching others receive the grace he was denied. He was tasked with upholding Christian society, but he was barred from its most sacred right. He was a pillar of the community, who had to stand outside the building. It's a level of psychological and spiritual dissonance that is hard to even comprehend. We worry today about work-life balance. The executioner had to worry about a work-damnation balance, and the scales were permanently tipped against him. This official exclusion was bad enough, but the world of folk belief and superstition was, in many ways, even more terrifying. The official church might have offered a complex, if unsatisfying, theological justification for his role. The whispers of the common folk offered none. To them he was simply tainted, cursed. His touch was thought to be profoundly unlucky, if not actively dangerous. To shake the executioner's hand was to invite misfortune, sickness, or even death into your life. This wasn't just a social snub, it was a deeply held magical belief. People would literally recoil from him in the street. If he brushed against you in the market, you might spend the rest of the day worrying what terrible omen that was. This belief created a strange and morbid economy around him. While his person was considered cursed, the tools of his trade and, chillingly, the bodies of his victims were seen as possessing a powerful dark magic. We spoke of his side hustles, selling the grease of the poor sinner, or a hangman's rope. People desperately wanted these items for folk remedies and magical charms. A sliver of the gallows could cure a toothache. The touch of a condemned man's hand could heal a skin condition. So you have this bizarre situation where a mother might recoil in fear if the executioner's shadow falls upon her child. But that same night, she might send her husband to the executioner's lonely house to discreetly buy a finger bone from the man he just dismembered, hoping it will cure their son's epilepsy. They wanted the magic of his dark world, but they wanted him to stay firmly within it. They needed his services, both legal and magical, but they needed him to remain the other, the monster, so they could remain the good, respectable, God-fearing folk. And what did all of this do to the man himself? How did he navigate this spiritual minefield every single day? We have so few first-hand accounts, but we can piece together a picture of the internal landscape of a man at war with his own soul. For many, the only way to cope was through a kind of hyper-professionalism, a ritualization of their grim work. The execution wasn't just a job, it was a performance with its own script, and following that script might have been the only thing that kept them sane. Part of this script, in many towns and cities, was the ritual of asking the condemned for forgiveness. Just before the final act, the executioner would kneel before the prisoner and formally ask their pardon for what he was about to do. On the surface, it looks like a moment of humanity, a final small courtesy, but for the executioner, it was so much more. It was a desperate act of spiritual self-preservation. In that moment, he was trying to reframe the act. He was separating his person from his office. It's not me, the man, who is doing this to you. It is my office, the arm of the law. He needed the victim's forgiveness to unburden his own conscience. If the condemned granted it, and they often did, seeing it as their final act of Christian charity, then perhaps, just perhaps, the sin would not cling to the executioner's soul so tightly. It was a transfer of responsibility, a last-minute attempt to clean the slate before staining it again. He was essentially saying, "We are both trapped in this horrible play. You have your part, and I have mine. Let us not hold it against each other when the curtain falls." But what about when things went wrong? What about the botched executions? An execution was supposed to be swift. A single, clean blow. That was the ideal. But swords get dull. Axes slip. Ropes break. Sometimes the victim didn't die instantly. They would be left maimed, writhing in agony on the scaffold in front of a horrified, or, even worse, a jeering crowd. In those moments, the executioner's professional mask would shatter. He wasn't a dispassionate instrument of justice anymore. He was just a man, failing horribly at a terrible task, inflicting immense suffering. The crowd would turn on him, screaming insults, throwing refuse. His failure was not just a professional embarrassment, it was a sign to many that God did not approve of this execution. The heavens themselves were showing their displeasure through his incompetence. Imagine the psychological toll of that. The memory of a man taking 3 or 4 chops to behead. The sound of a man slowly strangling on a poorly made noose. These weren't abstract failures. They were visceral, multi-sensory horrors that he would have to carry with him back to his empty house. The official theology could justify a clean death. It had a much harder time justifying torture born of clumsiness. These moments were when the comforting paperwork of divine justice was ripped to shreds, leaving him alone with the raw, brutal reality of what he had done, and in a world that believed fervently in ghosts. It's almost impossible to imagine that these men didn't feel haunted, not just by guilt, but by the literal spirits of those they had dispatched from this world. Every creak of the floorboards in his isolated house, every gust of wind rattling the shutters, could be interpreted as a visit from the dead. The man he'd broken on the wheel, whose every bone he had systematically shattered, was that his moan in the wind. The woman he'd burned for witchcraft, whose screams had been drowned out by the crackling flames, was that her face he saw in the dying embers of his own hearth. He lived, quite literally, among the ghosts of his own making. His work created a constant stream of vengeful spirits with a very personal grudge. This wasn't a job you could leave at the office, because the office, in a way, followed you home and sat with you in the dark. So how could an executioner possibly hope for salvation? How could he balance the scales of his life, so heavily weighted with death and sin? For some, the answer was to try and buy their way back into God's good graces. It's one of history's great ironies. The executioner, shunned by the church in life, would often become one of its most generous benefactors. That blood money, that filth money we talked about, was sometimes funneled directly back into the institution that condemned him. An executioner might donate a huge sum to his local parish to pay for a new altar, a stained glass window, or a set of golden candlesticks. He might endow a chantry chapel, a small chapel where a priest was paid to say Mass in perpetuity, for a specific purpose. And what was that purpose? Often, it was for the souls of the people he had executed, and of course for his own. It was a desperate spiritual transaction. Here is the money I earned by sending these souls to you, God. Please use it to help them on their journey, and maybe when my time comes, remember that I paid for the candles. It was an attempt to launder his tainted wealth, to turn the wages of sin into a down payment on a heavenly mansion. He was trying to use the fruits of his damnation to purchase his salvation. We even see the rise of what you might call the pious executioner. These weren't men who revelled in their work. They were men who saw it as a grim, solemn duty. The most famous example is Meister Franz Schmidt, the executioner of Nuremberg for over 40 years in the 16th century. He kept a detailed diary, not of his feelings but of his work. It's a stark professional log of every flogging, branding and execution he carried out. But between the lines, you see a man who craved respectability. He was also a healer on the side, a physician of sorts, and he took this role incredibly seriously. He was meticulous in his work, both as a healer and as a killer. He saw both as a service to the community. He prided himself on his clean, swift executions. He wasn't a butcher, he was a specialist, and his life's ambition was not to become wealthy, but to have his family's name restored to honourable status, to wash away the infamy of his profession, which, eventually, he achieved. Men like Schmidt represent the ultimate struggle of the executioner's soul. They didn't reject the system that ostracised them. They desperately wanted to be accepted by it. They tried to be the best, most honourable executioners they could be, in the hope that their professionalism and piety could somehow outweigh the inherent sin of their job. They tried to live a devout Christian life in every aspect that was permitted to them. They prayed harder. They gave more to charity. They lived quiet, sober lives. They were trying to prove to their community, and perhaps more importantly, to their God, that the hand that wielded the sword of justice could also be a hand folded in prayer. But it was a battle that could never truly be won. The taint was too deep, the sin too fundamental. No matter how many prayers he said, no matter how much money he gave, no matter how swift his blade, he was still the man who brought death. He lived in a permanent state of spiritual crisis. He was the scapegoat for society's own violence. They needed a sinner so they could all feel like saints. They needed a man to stand in the back of the church so they could feel closer to the altar. And so, as he lay in his bed at night, in that lonely house on the edge of town, the sounds of the wind might have sounded like the whispers of the dead, and the darkness might have seemed like a preview of the damnation to come. He was the state's most necessary man, and God's most difficult question, a soul in peril, who walked a tightrope over the fires of hell every single day, just by going to work. His only hope was that when his own time came, and he stood before the ultimate judge, there would be some form of divine understanding, a kind of celestial fine print, that made an exception for the man who was only following orders. But it was a hope whispered against the roar of a guilty conscience, a prayer for mercy from a man who had shown so little of it himself. Chapter 5. Beyond the Scaffold. The wider world of pain. A prayer for mercy from a man who had shown so little of it himself. But that assumes that mercy was ever part of the transaction. In his professional life it was a foreign currency, a concept as abstract as the stars. The orders he followed, the ones that gnawed at his soul in the quiet hours, didn't always lead him to the clean final break of the scaffold. That was the grand theatre, the public service announcement. The real grinding day-to-day work often took place far from the cheering or jeering crowds, in places where the only sound was the drip of water and the tight, strained breathing of another human being. Because while we call him the executioner, that title is a bit like calling a surgeon a bone setter. It's true, but it misses the vast, intricate, and far more disturbing scope of the job description. The public finale was just that, a finale. It was the last act in a play that often began long before, in the chilling quiet of a stone room, where the executioner's primary role was not to end a life, but to meticulously, systematically and legally break it. He was the state's official instrument of pain, its sanctioned torturer. To our modern minds, the very idea of judicial torture is monstrous, a relic of a barbaric age. We operate in theory on principles of evidence, of forensics, of a case built beyond a reasonable doubt. The medieval legal system, however, had a slightly different operating system. It was obsessed with one thing above all else, the confession. A confession was called the queen of proofs. Without it, even with a mountain of circumstantial evidence, a conviction for a serious crime was often impossible. It was the golden ticket, the absolute legal certainty that the courts craved. And here you find the terrible, unyielding logic of the system. What do you do when the entire legal machine is designed to run on the fuel of confession, but the accused refuses to provide it? Well, you don't just throw your hands up and say, "Darn, foiled again." You don't go looking for DNA evidence that doesn't exist. You create a system to strongly encourage a confession. The law, in its majestic and terrifying wisdom, authorized the use of the question, and the man hired to ask that question was not a lawyer, but our executioner. He was the physical arm of the interrogator's will. He was the technician in a grim human experiment, tasked with applying precise, escalating amounts of suffering until the Queen of Proofs made her royal appearance. So let's leave the public square behind for a moment. Let's follow him from the sunlight into the gloom. We descend a set of slick, worn stone steps, the air growing colder, heavier, smelling of damp earth, mildew, and something else, something acrid and metallic, the scent of old fear. We are in his other office, the torture chamber. This wasn't a place of frenzied, chaotic violence. That's a common misconception. It was a place of chilling order and procedure. It was a government facility, a laboratory of pain. The tools of the trade were not scattered about like a madman's playthings. They were maintained, oiled, and understood with the intimate knowledge of a master craftsman. The executioner knew the breaking point of a rope, the tensile strength of a human shoulder, the exact number of turns on a screw required to elicit a scream rather than silence. This was his terrible craft. Perhaps the most iconic piece of equipment, the centerpiece of this dreadful collection, was the rack. In its design, it was brutally simple, a rectangular wooden frame, often just a few feet off the ground, with rollers at either end. The victim's ankles were fastened to one roller, their wrists to the other. A simple lever and ratchet system allowed the executioner to slowly, deliberately turn the rollers, stretching the body. It was a process of horrifying escalation. The first few turns would simply be uncomfortable, a pulling in the joints. Then came the real pain, as muscles, stretched beyond their limits, began to tear. The sound of it was said to be a soft, sickening popping, like wet cloth ripping. Ligaments would snap, cartilage would tear, and if the process continued, the joints themselves, shoulders, hips, knees, elbows, would be pulled from their sockets with a final, grinding dislocation. The interrogator, often a magistrate or a priest, would stand nearby, calmly posing his questions in the space between the turns of the lever. "Did you conspire against the Duke?" Click. Groan. "Who were your accomplices?" Click. A scream. "Just tell us the truth." Click. The sound of a shoulder giving way. The executioner wasn't the one asking the questions. His job was to listen for the instruction. Another turn. He was the human extension of the machine, a silent, grim-faced figure applying pressure, observing the results, and waiting for the next command. He was a master of calibration, knowing just how far to push a body before it broke entirely, because a dead witness could offer no confession. A close cousin to the rack, working on a similar principle but with a different kind of terror, was the strappado. There was no elaborate frame here, just a rope, a pulley, and a high ceiling. The victim's hands were tied behind their back, and the rope was then looped through their wrists and hoisted upwards. This action alone was enough to force the shoulders into a horribly unnatural position, often dislocating them almost immediately. The initial hoist, leaving the victim dangling by their contorted arms, was often enough to produce the desired result. But the strappado had a cruel second act. If a confession was not forthcoming, the executioner could add weights to the victim's ankles, increasing the strain. And for the grand finale, there was the drop. The victim would be hoisted high into the air. Then the rope would be suddenly released, letting them plummet towards the floor before being jerked to a stop just inches from the ground. The violent deceleration would not only dislocate the shoulders but could tear muscles from the bone, snap the clavicles, and cause unimaginable internal damage. It was simple, efficient, and utterly devastating. To the victim, it was a repeated mock execution, a fall into nothingness that ended not in the release of death, but in a fresh, explosive wave of agony. Not all tools were so dramatic. Some were smaller, more intimate, designed for a focused, concentrated application of misery. Take the thumbscrews, a simple vise, often made of iron, with 2 or 3 bars that would be placed on either side of a thumb, a big toe, or a finger. The top was a screw. With each turn, the bars would press closer together. It started as pressure, then became a deep, crushing ache. Then the first layer of the nail would crack. As the screw was tightened further, the bone itself would begin to splinter and flatten, the digit reduced to a pulp of flesh and shattered bone. It was a personal, almost detail-oriented form of misery, a small device that could fill a room with world-ending pain. And if you wanted to apply that same principle to a larger area, there was the boot, not a single device, but a category of them. The most common was a wooden casing that enclosed the leg from ankle to knee. Wedges would then be hammered by the executioner into the space between the casing and the leg. With each strike of the mallet, the pressure on the shin and calf would intensify, compressing the flesh, and eventually shattering the tibia and fibula. The sound of the hammer striking the wedge was the steady, rhythmic percussion of the interrogation, each blow a punctuation mark in a sentence of suffering. Another version, sometimes called the Spanish boot, was a metal device that was slowly heated, roasting the leg inside. Then there was the subversion of life's most basic elements, water. The source of all life became an instrument of terrifying torment in the form of the water cure. The victim would be strapped down, often with their head lower than their feet, and their mouth forced open. The executioner would then pour vast quantities of water down their throat. The stomach would distend, creating a horrific sensation of drowning from the inside out. The body's own gag reflexes would turn against it. If this didn't produce a confession, a plank would often be placed on the bloated stomach, and the executioner would press down, causing the water to violently erupt from the victim's mouth and nose, often causing internal ruptures. It was torture without a single mark on the skin, a clean, efficient method of bringing a human being to the brink of suffocation, over and over again. All of this was done in the name of the law. There would be a clerk present, with quill and ink, dutifully writing it all down. The accused, upon the first turn of the rack, remained silent. The accused, upon the first turn of the rack, remained silent. The executioner was simply a cog in this machine, a specialist brought in for a specific task, and in some twisted sense, it required immense skill. He had to be a student of anatomy, of endurance, of the subtle signs that a person was about to faint versus the signs they were about to die. He was, in the most literal sense possible, the human resources department for the administration of pain, and even when this grim work in the dungeon was done, his duties in the public square were not limited to the gallows or the axe. He was also responsible for all forms of corporal punishment, the legal system's way of marking a body without necessarily ending its life. Public flogging was a common sentence for lesser crimes. The executioner would strip the convicted person to the waist, tie them to a post in the market square, and administer the prescribed number of lashes. His tool might be a simple leather whip, or the dreaded cat-o'-nine-tails, a multi-thonged whip often knotted or tipped with metal. His technique was crucial. He had to make it a spectacle of suffering, each lash drawing blood and a cry of pain. Yet he had to ensure the person survived their sentence. Too light, and the crowd might feel cheated of justice. Too heavy, and he could easily kill a man, turning a punishment into an unsanctioned execution. It was a performance, and he was the lead actor. Then there was branding. This was punishment as permanent record-keeping. A thief might be branded with a T on their cheek or hand, a forger with an F. The executioner would have a collection of iron brands, which he would heat in a brazier until they glowed red-hot. The hiss and smell of burning flesh as the brand was applied was another piece of street theatre, a warning to all who watched. This wasn't just about pain, it was about shame. It was a label you could never remove, a billboard of your past sins that you carried with you for the rest of your days, forever marking you as an outcast. And for some crimes, the punishment was horribly literal, a form of symbolic mutilation. A perjurer, who had spoken false words under oath, might have their tongue pierced with a hot iron. A poacher who had illicitly hunted in the Lord's forest might have an ear or a finger cut off. A thief might lose the hand that stole. These acts required a steady hand and a strong stomach. The executioner, with a sharp knife or a small cleaver, would perform these amputations quickly and clinically, often cauterizing the wound with a hot iron to stop the bleeding. It was crude, brutal surgery performed in the open air, another part of the wide and varied portfolio of state-sanctioned violence. So when we picture our executioner, we must see him not just as the man in the black hood on the scaffold. That was the final declarative statement of his career. But his life, his work, his daily reality was far more varied and in many ways far more intimate in its cruelty. It was the slow, creaking turn of a wheel in a damp cellar. It was the precise, measured tap of a mallet on a wooden wedge. It was the steady hand holding a glowing piece of iron to a stranger's cheek. It was the constant, direct physical application of pain, day in and day out. After a long session with the rack, or a public flogging that left the cobblestones slick with blood, he would clean his tools, lock the chamber door, and walk home. He would walk through the same streets, past the same shops, as the people who both feared and relied upon his services. He would sit down to his own dinner, his hands perhaps still aching from the effort of turning a windlass or wielding a whip. The grand dramatic act of execution might have offered a certain clean finality, a clear end to a story, but this other work, this was a grinding, repetitive process. It was a career built not on death, but on the meticulous cultivation and management of human suffering. And one has to wonder, as he lay in his own bed at night, if he could still hear the echoes of his work, the snap of a ligament, the hiss of hot iron, the desperate gasping whisper of a name, any name, just to make the pain stop. Chapter 6. The Reluctant Performer. Spectacle, riot, and the psychology of the crowd. The grand dramatic act of execution might have offered a certain clean finality, a clear end to a story, but this other work, this was a grinding, repetitive process. It was a career built not on death, but on the meticulous cultivation and management of human suffering. And one has to wonder, as he lay in his own bed at night, if he could still hear the echoes of his work, the snap of a ligament, the hiss of hot iron, the desperate gasping whisper of a name, any name, just to make the pain stop. And yet those quiet, echoing moments of his private trade were, in a way, the rehearsal. They were the lonely hours spent practicing his craft, away from the public eye, because the main event, the performance for which he was truly known and feared, was anything but quiet. It was the complete antithesis of the dark, secret work in the dungeon. It was loud, it was public, and it was, for all intents and purposes, a piece of theatre, a deeply strange, horrifying, and absolutely essential piece of medieval theatre. Let's set the stage. The location is usually the town square, or a specially designated field just outside the city walls. The air, long before the main event begins, is thick. It smells of damp earth, of unwashed humanity packed in tight, of roasted nuts and cheap ale from vendors who have set up their stalls to capitalize on the day's entertainment. Yes, entertainment. We must not be shy about that word. For many, this was a day out, a break from the relentless drudgery of field or workshop. It was a chance to see friends, to catch up on gossip, to feel a part of something larger than oneself. And at the center of it all, a stark wooden stage is being erected. The scaffold. It wasn't just a platform. It was a statement. Its height was carefully calibrated, not so high that the details were lost, but high enough that everyone, even the boy perched on his father's shoulders at the very back, could get a clear view. This wasn't about privacy. It was about broadcast. This was the state's most powerful and visceral form of communication. Forget royal proclamations that half the audience couldn't read anyway. This was a message that was understood in the gut. It was a press release written in blood and bone. Our man, the executioner, is backstage, so to speak, perhaps in a nearby jail or a guard tower, checking his equipment. The tools of his public trade were often different from his private ones. They were bigger, more symbolic. The axe, for instance. It needed to be not just sharp, but visibly, gleamingly sharp. The sword, if used for a noble execution, had to be long and immaculate. These weren't just implements. They were props. They were part of the costume, part of the ritual, and as he waits, he can hear the crowd. It isn't a single sound. It's a living, breathing thing, a low murmur that swells into a roar as a cart passes, then subsides into a hum of 1,000 private conversations. He is listening to his audience, and he knows, better than anyone, how quickly that audience can turn. The entire event was what we might today call a state-sponsored morality play. Every single element was drenched in symbolism, designed to reinforce the social order. The procession of the condemned from the jail to the scaffold was the first act. This wasn't just a walk, it was a carefully managed parade of shame. The prisoner, often in a simple white shift, was made to walk through the jeering, spitting, prodding crowds. It was a ritual of humiliation, of stripping away the individual's identity and reducing them to a single cautionary tale. This is what happens when you break the rules. The priest walking alongside, urging a final confession, wasn't just there for the condemned soul, he was there for the audiences, a visible reminder that even in this moment of brutal state power, the church was present, offering a path to spiritual redemption even as the body was being destroyed. It was a powerful partnership of temporal and divine authority. Then comes the arrival at the scaffold. The prisoner is led up the steps. The charges are read out loud, in a booming, formal voice by a town official. This is the legal justification, the why of the spectacle. It's the program notes for the play, reminding everyone that this is not murder, this is justice, this is the law, in its most absolute and terrifying form. And now, our man makes his entrance, the executioner, often hooded, though not always. The hood itself is a fascinating piece of theatre. It's not just about hiding his identity. Everyone in town knew who he was. His father was probably the executioner, and his son might be too. No, the hood served a different purpose. It transformed him from a man, a neighbour, a person you might pass in the market, into an impersonal instrument of the state. He wasn't John Smith beheading Thomas Jones. He was the law itself, faceless and inexorable, delivering the inevitable consequence. He became a symbol, a walking embodiment of the Duke's or the King's power over life and death. Now he is on the stage, at the centre of this swirling vortex of human emotion, and the pressure he is under is almost unimaginable. If you've ever felt nervous about public speaking or giving a presentation at work, take a moment and try to scale it up. Imagine your presentation involves a single, precise physical action. Imagine that if you get it wrong, if you hesitate, if your hand slips, if your aim is untrue, the immediate result is not just a moment of awkwardness, but the horrific, prolonged agony of a fellow human being right in front of you. And imagine that your audience, numbering in the hundreds or thousands, will not just give you a poor review, they will erupt into a violent, uncontrollable rage. They will see your failure not as a simple mistake, but as a moral failing, a sign that you are incompetent, cruel, and perhaps even enjoying the butchery you have created. They might storm the scaffold. They might try to tear you limb from limb. This wasn't a hypothetical risk. It happened. Crowds at public executions were notoriously volatile. They were a strange mix of pious and morbidly curious, sober and drunk, empathetic and bloodthirsty. Their mood could turn on a dime. If the condemned was a popular local figure, seen as a victim of injustice, the crowd was already a tinderbox waiting for a spark. If the condemned was a hated villain, a child murderer for instance, the crowd's bloodlust might be so intense that they'd try to get to the prisoner themselves to enact their own, far messier form of justice before the official sentence could be carried out. The executioner stood directly in the middle of this psychological powder keg. His job was not just to kill a person, but to manage the collective emotions of an entire town. Part of this management involved a strange and delicate piece of choreography between the executioner and the condemned. In many traditions, before the final blow, the executioner would kneel before the prisoner and ask for their forgiveness. Think about the sheer psychological complexity of that moment. The man about to take your life is asking you, the victim, to absolve him of the act. It was a crucial part of the ritual. For the condemned, it offered a final moment of agency, of moral superiority. For the executioner, it was a practical necessity. It framed the act not as personal malice, but as a sorrowful duty. It demonstrated to the crowd that he was not a monster, but a man doing a terrible job required by the state, a prisoner who granted forgiveness, helped to calm the crowd, to sanctify the proceedings. A prisoner who spat and cursed the executioner, on the other hand, could inflame them. Then there was the prisoner's own final performance, the last words. This was a tradition with immense power. The scaffold was, for a few brief moments, the most potent pulpit in the land. A condemned man or woman had nothing left to lose, and their words carried a unique weight. Some gave penitent speeches, confessing their crimes, warning others not to follow their path, and praising the justice of the king. These were the speeches the authorities hoped for. They were the neat, tidy conclusion to the morality play. They reinforced the official narrative. The sinner repents, the state is just, the world makes sense. But many did not follow that script. Some used their final moments to proclaim their innocence, to curse the corrupt officials who sentenced them, or to make political statements. These were incredibly dangerous moments for the authorities. A charismatic speaker with a compelling claim of innocence could sway the crowd in an instant. The mood could shift from morbid fascination to righteous fury. Suddenly, the executioner is no longer the instrument of justice. He's the instrument of tyranny. He's the villain of the play, and the crowd might well decide to rewrite the ending. He had to watch the crowd's faces, listen to their murmurs, feel the energy shifting, all while preparing to perform the most difficult physical task of his life. Let's talk about that task. A beheading with a sword or an axe. It sounds simple, one swing, but the reality was anything but. The human neck is a complex column of muscle, sinew and bone. To sever it cleanly in a single blow required incredible strength, precision, and a tool of exceptional quality. It also required the cooperation, willing or not, of the condemned. A person who flinched, or struggled, or moved at the last second could turn a clean execution into a gruesome spectacle of hacking and sawing. This is why the executioner often had assistants, whose job was to hold the person still, to hold their hair, to ensure the neck was perfectly exposed. A botched execution was the executioner's ultimate nightmare. It was a professional failure of the highest order. Take, for example, the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. Her executioner Bull and his assistant are said to have bungled the job terribly. The first blow missed her neck, hitting the back of her head. The second blow did not fully sever the neck, leaving a gristle of sinew that had to be cut with the axe as if it were a butcher's knife. The crowd, composed of stern-faced nobles, was reportedly horrified. When the executioner finally lifted the head to show the crowd, as was custom, he grabbed it by the red hair, only for the hair to turn out to be a wig, and the head, with its short grey hair, tumbled to the floor. It was a moment of pure, grotesque farce. For a professional, this was the equivalent of a world-class surgeon amputating the wrong leg in front of a gallery of his peers. It destroyed his reputation for competence, which was the only shred of professional dignity he had. For a common criminal, the consequences of a botched job were far more immediate. The crowd would not just gasp in horror, they would roar in outrage. To them, a clumsy executioner was inflicting needless torture. It violated the unwritten rules of the spectacle. They came for justice, swift and terrible, not for a display of inept butchery. They would throw stones, vegetables, off. They would surge towards the scaffold. The guards would have to form a protective ring, not around the condemned, but around the executioner. His life was now in very real danger, all because of a moment's hesitation, a slight miscalculation of angle or force. He had failed in his one essential duty, to provide a good death. Hanging was no simpler. It seemed straightforward, but the mechanics of it were poorly understood for a very long time. The goal, as we now know, is to snap the neck by having a drop of a specific length, causing instant death. This is the so-called long drop method, a relatively modern invention. In the medieval period, it was almost always a short drop. The condemned was simply turned off a ladder, or pulled up from a cart. The result was not a broken neck, it was a slow, agonizing death by strangulation. The body would thrash and convulse for several minutes. This was known as the Dance of the Dead, and the crowd would watch, mesmerized and appalled. The executioner's job wasn't over when the victim stopped moving. He had to ensure death, Sometimes family members or friends of the condemned would pull on the hanging person's legs to hasten their death out of a sense of mercy. This was often tolerated. The executioner himself might do the same. A final, strange act of professional courtesy. He had to manage the process, keep the crowd back, and finally cut the body down. And then there were the even more theatrical methods of execution, reserved for the most heinous crimes. Burning at the stake, for heresy or witchcraft, was a particularly potent piece of theatre. Fire was seen as a purifying element. The burning wasn't just killing the body, it was symbolically cleansing the community of a corrupting influence. But it was a dreadful, slow, and unpredictable way to die. The executioner had to be a master of pyre building. Too much green wood, and the fire would smoulder, slowly roasting the victim in agonizing smoke before the flames even took hold. Too fast a fire, and the ropes might burn through, allowing the half-conscious victim to fall out of the flames, requiring the executioner to then wrestle them back into the inferno. Stories abound of executioners, out of a flicker of pity or a desire for a less chaotic scene, placing a bag of gunpowder around the condemned's neck. The hope was for a quick, explosive end. It was a technical challenge, layered on top of a moral and psychological one. The breaking on the wheel was perhaps the most purely sadistic of the public punishments. It was designed from start to finish to maximize and display suffering. The executioner used a heavy iron bar to systematically break the condemned's limbs over the spokes of a large wagon wheel. The number of blows and the order in which they were delivered was often specified by the court. The final blow, the coup de grâce or blow of mercy, was delivered to the chest or neck to end the suffering. But sometimes, the sentence explicitly forbade this final act of mercy. The broken victim would then be hoisted up on the wheel, their shattered limbs woven through the spokes, to be left to die of shock, dehydration and the attentions of carrion birds, often over a period of days. The executioner's job here was to be a meticulous artist of pain, a sculptor of human suffering, all for the public's edification. He had to be precise, strong, and emotionally detached enough to carry out a procedure of almost unimaginable cruelty, while a crowd watched his every move. This crowd, this ever-present character in our story, was not just a passive observer, it was an active participant. People believed that touching the corpse of an executed person, or a chip from the gallows, or the rope used for a hanging, could cure diseases, from toothaches to scrofula. The executioner often had the rights to the condemned's clothing and possessions, but he also controlled access to these morbid relics. After the main event, he would often find himself in the bizarre position of a merchant, selling pieces of the rope, or allowing people, for a fee, to touch the still warm hand of the deceased. It was a ghoulish cottage industry that sprung up in the shadow of the scaffold. This was the final act of the play, the audience coming on stage to collect their souvenirs. Imagine the psychological toll of this entire performance. The executioner had to be, all at once, a stage manager, a lead actor, a special effects technician, a priest-like figure, and a bouncer. He had to project an aura of absolute calm and competence, even as his heart was hammering in his chest. He had to read the mood of a thousand-headed beast and adjust his performance accordingly. He had to engage in an intimate, ritualized dialogue with the person he was about to kill. He had to perform a physically demanding feat of precision under the most intense pressure imaginable. And after the blood was spilled, the body cut down, and the crowd dispersed, he was left on his empty stage to clean his tools and go home. As the sun would set on the day of a public execution, the square would empty out. The vendors would pack their stalls, the chatter would fade, replaced by the evening sounds of the city. The scaffold would stand, stark and silent, a dark silhouette against the twilight, and our man would walk home, his ears no longer filled with the roar of the crowd, but perhaps, once again, with those other, quieter sounds, the echoes of his work, the snap of bone, the hiss of iron, the terrifying, deafening silence that followed the final public act. He had successfully performed his role. He had survived his audience, and he knew, with a certainty that must have settled deep in his bones, that he would have to do it all again. The play was over, but the show would always go on. Chapter 7. An Unwanted Legacy. Dynasty, family, and the hereditary curse. The show would always go on. But that simple, dreadful phrase held a deeper truth, a truth that extended far beyond the man himself. Because this wasn't just a job he had to do again. It was a role he would one day have to teach, a part his own son was destined to play. The most terrifying aspect of the executioner's life wasn't the single violent act on the scaffold. It was the fact that for so many, the job wasn't a choice. It wasn't a career path one stumbled into. It was a stain that was passed down through the blood, a hereditary curse wrapped in civic duty. We like to think of our family legacies in warm, comforting terms: a grandfather's watch, a grandmother's recipe book, a family business built on something noble like carpentry or baking. But imagine for a moment, the family business is death. Imagine the inheritance isn't a workshop filled with the scent of sawdust and oil, but a collection of ropes, irons and blades, each with its own grim history. Imagine the skill passed from father to son isn't the art of raising bread, but the precise science of ending a life. This was the reality for the executioner dynasties of Europe. The very concept feels alien to us now, a detail from a particularly grim fairy tale, but it was born of a brutally practical problem. No town wanted the job of executioner, but every town needed one. So when they finally found a man desperate enough, or coerced enough to take the position, they wanted to solve the problem for good. They wanted to lock it down for the next generation, and the one after that. The contract an executioner signed was often not just for his own lifetime. It was a package deal. You and your sons, and their sons, will serve this town as its bringer of justice. It was a municipal problem solved by creating a generational trap, a public service that functioned like a private prison. So the man who walked home from the scaffold, the cheers and jeers of the crowd finally fading, didn't just walk into a house. He walked into the next chapter of his own story, one where he was not the performer, but the teacher. He was the keeper of a terrible flame, and it was his sacred, awful duty to ensure it was never extinguished. Let's step over the threshold of that house with him. What do we find? Not perhaps the squalor you might imagine. Many executioners were reasonably well compensated. They were often given a house, a small stipend, and certain perquisites. But the house itself was different. It would have been set apart, often just outside the city walls, or in a designated less than desirable quarter. It was a home that was geographically and socially on the fringe. Its very location was a constant silent reminder of the family's status. This wasn't a house you casually dropped by to borrow a cup of sugar from. This was a house people made a wide detour to avoid. The air inside might be thick with the smell of medicinal herbs. Remember, part of the executioner's side hustle was an uncanny knowledge of the human body. He was often the unofficial town surgeon and bone setter. People who would never dream of speaking to him in the marketplace would come knocking at his door in the dead of night, a dislocated shoulder or a broken leg overriding their social revulsion. So the house might smell of tinctures and drying plants, a strange sterile scent layered over the ever-present phantom smell of iron and old blood that probably lived more in his mind than on his clothes. And who is inside this house? A family, a wife, children. And this is where the true, grinding horror of the executioner's legacy begins to unfold, because the stain of his profession was not his alone to bear. It was a contagion. It clung to everyone who shared his name, his roof, and his blood. Let's think about his wife. Who was she? Where did she come from? This wasn't a world of dating apps and endless choice. The marriage market for even a common farmer was a complex dance of dowries, family connections, and reputation. For the son of an executioner, that market was a barren wasteland. No respectable baker or blacksmith or tailor would ever allow his daughter to marry into such a family. To do so would be to invite dishonor upon his own house, to contaminate his own lineage. It was social suicide. So, where did a young executioner in training find a wife? He had to shop, so to speak, in a very specific, very limited marketplace, the community of the dishonorable. In the intricate social hierarchies of the medieval and early modern world, society had a whole category for people deemed untouchable or unclean. These were the unehrliche Leute, the dishonorable people. This group included knackers, who disposed of dead animals, skinners and tanners, who worked with filthy hides, gravediggers who dealt with the dead, night soil men who cleaned the city's latrines, and often prostitutes and their children, and of course, executioners. This created a closed loop, an isolated ecosystem of the outcast. An executioner's son almost invariably had to marry the daughter of another executioner from a neighbouring town, or perhaps the daughter of a knacker or a gravedigger. It was the only way to find a partner, to have a family. These marriages were less about romance and more about forging alliances between families who shared the same profound stigma. It was a union born of mutual necessity and shared isolation. Imagine the life of that woman, the executioner's wife. She lived with a constant humming background radiation of social contempt. When she went to the market, the other women would fall silent. They would part to let her pass, not out of respect, but out of a deep, ingrained fear of contamination. They wouldn't touch the coins she offered until she placed them on the counter, and they would place her change down for her to pick up, avoiding any skin-to-skin contact. She was the wife of the man who touched death, and therefore she was tainted by association. Her work at home was a litany of grim realities. She would be the one to wash his clothes after an execution, scrubbing away at stains that were both physical and symbolic. She managed a household that no neighbor would ever enter for a friendly chat. She raised her children in a bubble of silence and fear. She had to be a fortress of stability for a man whose profession was the absolute antithesis of domestic peace. Her resilience is a story almost never told, the quiet, unseen labor of holding a family together under the immense pressure of universal disgust. She was the curator of a cursed museum, the manager of a tainted legacy, and then there were the children. We complain today about the pressure to follow in our parents' footsteps, to join the family law firm or take over the hardware store. It feels like a closing of doors, a limitation on our potential. Now, place yourself in the mind of a small boy, the son of the executioner. From the moment you are old enough to understand the world, you are taught two things simultaneously. First, the world outside your door considers you and your family to be fundamentally unclean. And second, your father's grisly profession is not just his job, it is your destiny. The other children in the town would have been forbidden from playing with him. He would see them in the streets, running and shouting, and know that he was separated from them by an invisible, impenetrable wall. He was the boy whose father killed people for a living. Any taunts thrown his way would be of the cruelest, most literal kind. He was a ghost in his own village, a living embodiment of the community's darkest necessities. His education was a strange and specialized apprenticeship. While other boys were learning to plane wood or shoe a horse, he was learning human anatomy, not for the purpose of healing, but for the purpose of efficient state-sanctioned killing. His father, the man who was supposed to protect him from the world, was the very one who had to teach him how to navigate its most brutal realities. He would learn the different types of knots for a hanging to ensure a quick and clean death, or a slow and agonizing one, depending on the sentence. He would learn the precise spot on the neck to strike with a sword for a clean decapitation. He would be taught how to use the tongs and irons for branding, how to break a man's limbs on the wheel in the correct sequence, starting with the shins and forearms and working inward to prolong the agony as the sentence required. Imagine those lessons, a father and son, not in a field learning to hunt, but in a quiet, grim room, practicing with tools of the trade. The psychological weight of this inheritance is almost impossible for us to comprehend. It's one thing to be taught a difficult or unpleasant job. It's another to be taught a job that strips you of your humanity in the eyes of everyone you meet, a job that guarantees you will live and die as a pariah. There was no escape. To run away would be to break a legal contract, to bring ruin upon your family, and to be a fugitive with no skills other than those of torture and death. Where would you go? What would you do? The trade was his identity, branded onto him from birth. The daughters of the executioner faced a different, but equally constrained fate. She was, in a sense, the primary currency of this closed-off society. Her future was preordained. She would marry the son of another executioner, or a tanner, or a gravedigger. Her entire life was a journey from one dishonorable house to another. She carried the family stain with her, and her marriage was simply a strategic merger of two tainted bloodlines, a way to keep the grim business going. She had no hope of marrying for love into a clean family, of escaping her origins. Her legacy was to produce the next generation of the damned. To understand how deep this ran, we can look at the incredible story of the Sanson family in France. They weren't just any executioners. They were the royal executioners of Paris, a dynasty that held the office for over 150 years from father to son. Their story is remarkably well documented, a case study in the crushing weight of a hereditary curse. The Sansons were not uneducated brutes. They were literate, articulate men who often seemed to be at war with their own profession. They saw it as a duty, an inescapable burden placed upon them by birth and state. Charles Henri Sanson, the most famous of the line, was the man who executed King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, along with thousands of others during the French Revolution's reign of terror. He was, by all accounts, a reluctant executioner. He was a quiet, well-dressed man who was also an accomplished amateur physician. He hated his work. He pleaded with the revolutionary government for retirement. They refused. He was too good at his job, and his name was too synonymous with it. His personal diaries and letters reveal a man in profound psychological torment. He describes the duty as a hideous mantle he was forced to wear. After the execution of the king, he was said to be a broken man, haunted by the act he was compelled to perform. Yet, when the time came, he had to teach his son Henri the trade. He had to lead him onto the scaffold, guide his hands, and ensure the family legacy, this awful blood-soaked legacy, continued. Can you imagine the conversations between that father and son? The things left unsaid hanging in the air, thicker than any smoke. Henri, in turn, performed the role until his own son, Henri Clément, was ready to take over. But here the line began to break. Henri Clément Sonzon, the sixth and final executioner of the dynasty, was a man completely unsuited to the role. He was a dandy, a gambler, a man who loved high society, a society that would never ever truly accept him. He detested the family business. He saw it not as a solemn duty, but as a source of shame and revulsion. He became so deeply in debt from his lavish lifestyle that he pawned the very instrument of his trade, the guillotine. It's a detail so absurd, it sounds like fiction. The state executioner of France had to put the national instrument of death in hock to cover his gambling losses. When the government found out, he was summarily dismissed. And just like that, a dynasty that had lasted through revolutions and monarchies, that had shed the blood of kings and commoners, ended not with a bang, but with a whimper of financial irresponsibility. The hereditary curse was finally broken by a son who simply refused, in his own chaotic way, to carry it. He chose personal ruin over professional duty. For him, it must have felt like a kind of freedom. This was the exception, though. For most, the line continued unbroken for generations. The psychological toll is the part of the story we can only guess at. Did these men become numb to their work? Undoubtedly, to some degree. It's the only way they could have survived. But the social isolation, the knowledge that you and your children were seen as less than human, must have been a constant grinding pressure. It created a strange duality. At home, the executioner was a father, a husband. He might have been a gentle man, a loving parent. He had to be. He had to create a sanctuary of normalcy in a life that was anything but. This little island, his home, was the only place on earth where he wasn't the executioner, where he was just father, and yet he was the very source of the poison that isolated that island. He was both its protector and its contaminator. The children would grow up understanding this paradox. They would learn to live with the averted eyes, the whispered insults. They would learn that their world was small, populated only by others who shared a similar fate. It must have bred a deep sense of fatalism, a feeling that your life's path was a deep groove carved into the earth before you were even born, and all you could do was walk it. You didn't get to choose who you were. Society had already decided for you. Your last name was not just a name, it was a sentence. So when we picture that lone figure on the scaffold, remember that he is not truly alone. He is the visible product of a long, invisible chain. He stands on the shoulders of his father and his grandfather, and waiting in the wings, in that small house just outside the city walls, is a young boy who is watching and learning and waiting for the day when the sword or the axe or the rope is passed to him. The tools of the trade were the family heirlooms. The scaffold was the family stage, and the legacy was not one of wealth or honour, but of a quiet, unending shame, a shame that was the true, final, and most expertly delivered punishment of all. It was a sentence that didn't end with death. It was passed on to the living,